Thank you, Adam, and thank you for the introduction and the ability to speak today. So I'm going to give you what I think is the beginning of a story of excellence. I can't claim that it's the complete story yet, but it's what the work that we've been doing under the NextGen Cassava project, really aiming to identify actionable breeding targets that meet both diversity and demand. So this is a slide from Peter Koldrake that he shared with us a while back, and under the leadership of Vivian Pilar at SIP and a group of researchers at the Gender Breeding Initiative, we've been thinking about this framework of product profile development. And I won't go over this, you've probably seen it, but we think there's kind of a missing piece, and this is the customer profile. So as we go to identify a market segment that would drive the development of the product profile, we're advocating for kind of a middle ground in describing the social characteristics of the potential customers and how to include gender and social inclusion information in a quote unquote customer profile, which would lead to the market segment. So this is really the challenge that we're dealing with and that I'd like to speak to today with the work with NextGen Cassava. How do we understand the social characteristics and the potential customers and use that to define a market segment? Our approach in response to this challenge is kind of a three-way approach under the NextGen Cassava project. So I'll start up here on the right where it says trait descriptors. We're working with the RTB Foods project, which is a large project you may have heard about in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at RTB-based food products and defining what are the descriptors for high-quality products. Borrowing from methodology there, as well as other methodology we use, the first step is really understanding trait descriptors. What does that mean? Just understanding the words and the characteristics that individuals along the value chain for the products that we're working with describe good quality cassava in our case. And this is work that is going on in 3 countries, Tanzania, Uganda, and Nigeria, but I'll talk mostly about the Nigeria results. So using tools such as gendered food mapping, but also interviews, focus groups, and various other survey tools, we're kind of understanding very open-ended ways of understanding trait descriptors. In doing so, one thing that we're doing a little bit differently is being very intentional about selecting diverse participants. So we're not just going to communities and saying we're going to talk to 10 farmers. We're saying, what is the social makeup of that community that we're engaging? What are the geographical variations, wealth status, sex, age, migration status, and any other social difference that makes sense for that geography and that community, to make sure that we're sampling from that diversity in selecting the respondents for these tools that we're using. So that's the first step. You get a list of descriptors, and I'll show a little bit what that looks like in a minute. The second step is using those descriptors to develop typologies. And we're using a tool called 1000 Minds. I won't go into detail about this, but you can look in Google and their website is quite self-explanatory. It's a choice experimentation tool to develop typologies, but also economic values. So as we get these descriptors, winnow them down, feed them into this typology development step. Oops, sorry. Is how we use them. But another thing we've done a little bit different here is not just use 1000 Minds as it is, but we're adding 2 layers to that. And the first is using a household survey called ROMIS, which gives you not only food security indicator, but also poverty indicators. And I'll speak to why that's important in just a little bit. So we're taking basic social demographic information, but also poverty indicators and food security indicators. And we're also adding a layer of intra-household data collection. What that means is we run this tool with husbands, wives, and then a joint interview. So we're actually using it to see how discussions around relative ranking of traits in developing these typologies plays out in an intra-household dialogue. And not going into detail again, but we're kind of innovating on the basic tools to add more layers of information on decision-making and household level poverty and food security status. The third arm is after we develop these typologies, there's a concept saying, you can think about it as saying, if someone articulates their preferences, does that play out in their choices? So we're triangulating that with on-farm testing using a method called TriCod. Again, I won't go into details, but really looking at multiple time point trait combinations to see if selections on farm, and these are the same individuals that participate in both of these methods, to see if the typologies that we develop for individuals as we ask them to articulate their preferences plays out in their choices when varieties are grown on farm. And there's various drawbacks here, but again, I won't go into detail there. Just to give you a snapshot of what the results look like and what the kind of data that we're dealing with from the descriptor work, you often just see lists of traits, and they're mostly qualitative descriptors, and this is for particular products in Nigeria from cassava, which then gets fed into this 1,000 mines. And here's an example of what a typology looks like. What you see here are these 4 boxes labeled with these names. What that means is, if you look across value chain actors, this is all aggregate data for 800 odd respondents, there's a group of respondents who prioritize survival related traits, disease resistance, and ground storage time. There are a group of respondents who are prioritizing quality related traits. This is product quality, color, taste, root color. And there are a group of respondents who are prioritizing output related traits, root size, yield, maturity time, and so on and so forth. So we're seeing these kind of these 3 different groups, distinct groups coming out of our typology work. What we're again doing here is not stopping there and saying we're aggregating everyone into one big typology data set. We're then systematically going and disaggregating by sex. This is an example of typologies that we produce if we disaggregate by sex. We're doing the same thing for region, poverty status, food security status. So we're systematically taking all the indicators that we've collected and developing typologies for those different groups, just to see if there are different groupings coming out depending on how we parse the data. So we're in the process of going through that. And this is what we see when we do the on-farm work, is through TriCot, you kind of get this relative favorability, let's say, matrix. So you see in blue is the most favorable variety, is going down to red is the least favorable. Without going into detail, what this tells you is you can look at the community level. Mostly this is aggregated to community or region because of how the method is structured. But then you can see if a variety is performing or favored in a community/region, how does that relate to the typology that we know about respondents in that community or region prioritizing, and do those match? Another thing that we're doing to kind of streamline this TriCot method is looking to see if there are relationships between individual component traits and overall selection. What that means is we're asking at the end of the day for quality, which variety performs best. And to say, if we say now, not just for overall quality, but if you say cooking time or processing or taste or texture, which one of those most closely explains the overall selection? So then we can winnow down the traits and the time points to know exactly where to ask which question for these on-farm trials. So this, to me, is the most exciting output we've generated. This is very new data, and we're still working through everything, but I think it's really exciting. And what you're looking at here are columns of the grouping. So these are the clusters. The quality cluster, like I just showed, groups of individuals who are prioritizing quality-related traits. This is the output cluster, groups of individuals prioritizing output-related traits, and survivability. Same idea. What you're seeing kind of here along the rows are the indicators. So sorry, the variables that we're looking at to see if they're correlated with these clusters. What you see is if you're male, you will be actually there's an inverse relationship between the sex of the respondent being male and quality, which makes sense because in Nigeria, women are kind of dominating the processing, sale, and production of the cassava-related goods. What's really interesting to me is looking at things. This is the household food security indicator. So that means if you're food secure, you're less likely to be prioritizing survivability, more likely to be prioritizing quality. And if you look at the poverty indicator, you can start seeing an inverse relationship. So if you're higher poverty likelihood, you're less likely to prioritize quality, but more likely to prioritize survivability. These are weak associations, admittedly, and we're still waiting to see what's coming through. But it's interesting to see that a lot of our assumptions that we're making in breeding in some of these pipelines, if you imagine these are 3 breeding pipelines that we can think about, we can actually empirically start showing that if you're a poor household, you will indeed prioritize survivability. And that makes sense if you think about it, but we don't have the data to back that. And this is really exciting just to see that finally emerging, those associations. Empirically, we're being able to show this. And this last one is more gender related. If we look at, these are female control of assets. So if you have higher control, if women have higher control of assets as defined within this ROMAS survey, that you have a higher association with quality. So as women are we can say, quote unquote, more empowered to make some decisions or have higher access to assets, they will be prioritizing quality. So they have maybe the choice to be prioritizing the quality trait. So without going in too much into this is just really exciting snapshot of the work that the results that we're starting to get. What's next? The biggest challenge we're facing, I would say, is relating the different data types. So we're spending the next year trying to understand how do we relate the on-farm data to the typology data. So that's kind of a research question in itself. A big question is that we're facing is how do we feed this into ongoing product profile advancement meetings? What are the entry points for which kind of data? How do we distill it? Kind of speaking to Sarah's point earlier. And what are the viability of these approaches for breeding programs? We're looking at cost-benefit analysis to see, what is the cost of applying, for example, 1,000 mines or tricot, and is it worth it for the kind of data that we're getting? And just a last shout out to appreciate EIB for supporting over the last year and a half work with the Gender Breeding Initiative, again, under the leadership of Vivian Pollard, testing 2 different tools in different case studies. These are the customer profile tool, feeding into those steps I showed in the first slide. How do we segment and target customer profiles that lead to market segments? But also the product profile query tool, looking at how we can start rating different traits for positive or potential negative impacts on gender relations in women. And EIB has supported 2 case studies, one in IITA with cassava in Nigeria and one with beans with the Alliance in Zimbabwe. And there are other case studies supported by RTB and CG. And at this point, the case study participants and leads are really reflecting on their experience to feed into a second workshop. So I just want to acknowledge that EIB has been supporting this work, and we hope to see more of this support in the future. With that, I think I'm out of time, and I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Hale. That was very interesting. So we do have one question already. So please insert your questions. We probably have time for 2-3 minutes of questions. Insert them into the chat, or you can request to go live. So we have one question from Graham Thiel, who notes that it was a great presentation, and he is asking about 1,000 mines and whether it adequately captures the knowledge and preferences of value chain actors for quality traits.
Good question, Graham. This is an ongoing discussion we're having, and 1,000 mines is originated in marketing. And it's been used a lot in animal breeding, but for plants, there's, I think, 3 cases now. It's sweet potato, cassava, and rice. So we're trying it in crops. And I would say there's things we need to improve. So, Graham brings up a great point, is who we're talking to across the value chain. And the issue I see is we're asking the same questions to all actors along the value chain, which in itself is problematic because they'll have very different viewpoints and very different way of ranking and rating. And there may be questions that are specific to actors in the value chain. So I think that's a sampling and design question that we haven't quite cracked. But maybe with modification, the answer is yes, Graham. But as it stands, we're working through those exact issues. So yeah, good. Oh, am I supposed to look in the chat?
Thank you, Hale. Yeah, I've just granted Gary Atlin video access, but I'm not quite sure whether he's showing up. He had a question for you. It appears he might be having a video issue, which happens sometimes on Hopin, unfortunately. So,
so I can read it, or.
Okay, so Sarah is here with a question instead.
Yeah, I do have a question.
Oh, and there's Gary.
There's Gary. You want to go first, okay. Gary?
Yeah, go ahead, Gary. Thanks for joining.
Great presentation, Hale. Thanks. Basically, I had 2 questions. One is you referred to the groupings in the 1,000 mines analysis as potential pipelines. Would it not also be appropriate to think of them as groups whose knowledge and preferences need to be weighted into product profiles rather than separate pipelines?
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
And then the other one, simply that, you were raising the point of how you would incorporate this information in advancement meetings. And it seems to me what you want to do is get the information into the product profile and then have the advancement meetings. The advancement meeting is mainly about, I think, whether, you know, individual products meet the product profile closely enough, you know, to be able to either be used as parents, that's one advancement decision, or commercialized, that's another advancement decision. We need to think about the difference between those. They're not the same decision. But so those are the 2 points. It would seem to me it's not mainly for separate pipelines, although, you know, potentially I suppose it could be. The mechanism is really get that product profile right and then use it for as your guideline for advancement.
Gary, and I think those are both excellent points. The thing why I mentioned in the next year you're going to work on data integration is exactly for that. So how do you weight this information? That's a nut we haven't cracked, because and that's what the G+ tools are doing too. How do you assign a social relevance and a weight to a trait that you have a lot of qualitative or gender-based information on? It's not an automatic shoe-in. It's not like, okay, I know the weight for this. So a lot of our work is going to focus around how to crack that specific nut. So I agree that the natural home would be going straight into product profile, but the weight is what we're working on this year, I would say. And the second is agreed that it should go in the product profile, not the advancement meetings. So far, it's been through advancement meetings that these discussions have been happening, but I agree we should shift that more towards direct integration in the product profile.